Power is not what you do to people. It's what you choose not to do, the voice would later say. But on that morning, Anna Keller did not believe in restraint. She believed in consequences, in everything she had been told would happen the moment her boots touched British soil. The transport ship groaned as it settled against the dock, iron against wood, a dull echo rolling across gray water that stretched for miles under a sky the color of cold steel. And when the hatch opened, the air hit her. First, sharp, wet, unfamiliar. Nothing like the dry dust of the places she had come from. This air carried salt, and something else, something clean, something that made her lungs hesitate before accepting it. Behind her, 32 women stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms worn thin, their posture held not by strength but by habit, and no one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in whispers during the long crossing. Stories of what waited for them. Stories that had grown sharper with repetition, more certain with fear. Anna adjusted her grip on the small cloth bundle in her hands, the only thing she had been allowed to keep, and when the line began to move, she stepped forward with it, one measured step at a time, each footfall quiet against the metal floor until it became wood, until it became foreign ground. She expected noise, commands shouted in a language she barely understood, the crack of authority that would define everything that followed. But when she reached the bottom of the ramp, what met her instead was silence. Not the absence of sound, but a controlled silence, the kind that felt deliberate, shaped, as if every person present had agreed, without speaking, to hold it in place. Rows of British soldiers stood 10 feet apart, boots aligned, uniforms pressed, rifles resting but not raised. Their faces unreadable in a way that unsettled her more than anger ever could, because anger she understood, anger meant direction, meant intention. But this was something else entirely. One soldier shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his glove creaking, another adjusted the angle of his cap by less than an inch, small movements, contained, precise, and none of it matched the images she had carried with her across the ocean. Anna slowed without realizing it, her eyes moving from one face to another, searching for something familiar, something she could recognize as threat. But what she found instead was discipline, a kind of stillness that did not need to prove itself. A woman beside her stumbled slightly as she stepped onto the dock, her shoe catching on a seam in the wood, and for a fraction of a second, Anna's body reacted before her mind did, her hand moving as if to steady her, but she stopped herself, because helping another prisoner in the wrong moment could draw attention, and attention was the last thing anyone wanted. The woman recovered on her own, straightened, and the line continued forward, guided not by shouted orders but by subtle gestures, a nod here, a slight turn of the hand there, as if the entire process had been rehearsed until words were no longer necessary. Ahead, a man stood slightly apart from the others, not elevated, not positioned above them, but centered in a way that drew the eye without demanding it, his coat darker, his posture relaxed but exact. And when Anna looked at him, he was already looking at her, not with curiosity, not with hostility, but with a level gaze that seemed to measure without judging. Captain James Whitmore, though she did not know his name yet, did not speak immediately, and that delay stretched longer than any command would have, because it gave her time to anticipate, to prepare for something that did not arrive. Instead, he stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them. By a single pace, removed his gloves with deliberate care, and held them in one hand. A gesture so ordinary it felt out of place in everything she had expected. "You are under protection," he said, his voice even, not loud, not soft, the words shaped clearly, as if he intended them to be understood the first time. Anna felt the sentence land without meaning, the words themselves simple, but the idea behind them incompatible with everything she had been told, and for a moment, her mind rejected it entirely, replacing it with the assumption that this was a prelude, a necessary step before something else, something harsher, something real. The line moved again, and she moved with it, but now every detail sharpened, every sound distinct, the faint rhythm of boots on wood, the distant call of a gull somewhere beyond the dock, the soft rustle of fabric as the women adjusted their steps to match one another. And still, no one shouted, no one rushed them, no one forced the pace. A soldier to her right shifted slightly as she passed, his hand lifting just enough to indicate direction, not touching her, not crowding her space. And that absence of contact registered more strongly than any grip would have. 10 yards ahead, the path opened toward a set of low buildings, their edges clean, their arrangement precise. Nothing out of place, nothing improvised. And as Anna crossed that distance, she became aware of something she had not expected to feel. Uncertainty not about what would happen to her body, but about what would happen to her understanding of the world she thought she knew. Because nothing here matched the narrative she had carried. And if that narrative was wrong, even in part, then everything built on it began to shift, slowly, quietly, like ground settling beneath her feet. She kept her eyes forward, her posture steady, but inside, something had already begun to change. Not trust, not yet, but the first fracture in certainty, and it was that fracture, more than anything else, that made her realize this place would not be what she had prepared for. The line did not stop when they reached the buildings, it only slowed, as if the place itself demanded a different rhythm, and Anna felt it immediately, the way her steps adjusted without instruction, the way even her breathing seemed to fall into a quieter pattern. The gravel beneath her boots changed the sound of movement, softer, less echo, and the air carried the faint scent of soap and something warm, something like bread, though she could not see where it came from. To her left, a door opened, and a British soldier stepped out carrying a folded stack of blankets, his arms steady, his pace unhurried, and he did not look at them with curiosity or disdain. He simply moved past, as if this moment, this arrival, was not a spectacle but a routine. Anna noticed the edges of everything, the straight lines of the windows, the even spacing of the doors, the absence of anything broken or temporary, and it unsettled her more than ruins ever could. Because ruins made sense in war, ruins confirmed what she knew, but this order, felt like a contradiction she could not resolve. The women ahead of her were guided toward a long, low building, its paint intact, its steps clean, and when Anna crossed the threshold, she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, because inside, the light was different, softer, filtered through wide windows that allowed the gray sky to enter without harshness. Rows of cots lined the room, evenly spaced, each with a folded blanket placed at the foot, each identical, each waiting. No one rushed them to choose, no one assigned numbers. And that lack of immediate control created a new kind of tension, because Anna did not know where she was supposed to stand, where she was supposed to look, and for the first time since stepping off the ship, she felt the edge of uncertainty shift inward. A woman beside her, younger, her hands trembling slightly, moved toward the nearest cot and touched the blanket as if testing whether it was real. And when nothing happened, when no voice corrected her, others followed, slowly, cautiously, each movement tentative, like people learning the rules of a place that had not yet revealed them. Anna remained near the entrance for a moment longer, watching, measuring, her eyes moving from one detail to another, and then she heard it. A small sound, barely noticeable, the faint clink of metal against ceramic. She turned her head, and through an open doorway at the far end of the room, she saw a table, long, wooden, with cups arranged in neat rows, and a thin line of steam rising into the air. Tea. The word formed in her mind with a kind of disbelief, because tea belonged to a different world, a quieter one, a world that did not align with transport ships and guarded docks. A British orderly stood behind the table, pouring carefully, his movements precise, and when he looked up and saw the women watching, he did not call out, he did not gesture sharply, he simply nodded once, as if to say the invitation was there if they chose to accept it. No one moved at first. Anna felt the familiar resistance return, the instinct to wait, to observe, to let someone else take the first risk, because that was what this was. It had to be a test of some kind, a moment designed to reveal something about them. The silence stretched, and then the younger woman who had touched the blanket stepped forward, her steps small, her shoulders tight, and she approached the table with the caution of someone expecting the ground to shift beneath her. The orderly poured a cup, placed it in front of her, and stepped back. No words, no insistence. The woman stared at the cup, then at him, and then, slowly, she lifted it. bringing it close enough that the steam brushed her face. Anna watched every movement, every hesitation, her own breath, held without realizing it. And when the woman finally took a small sip, nothing happened. No reaction, no consequence. The woman's shoulders lowered by an inch, and she took another sip, slightly larger this time. And then she turned back toward the others, her expression not smiling, not relieved, but changed in a way Anna could not yet define. That was enough. The line that had held them in place broke, not all at once, but in small shifts, one woman stepping forward, then another, until the room began to fill with quiet movement, cups lifted, hands warming around them, the soft sound of drinking replacing the earlier silence. Anna did not move immediately. She watched, her mind still searching for the hidden edge, the moment where this would reveal itself as something else, something harsher, but it did not come. The orderly continued to pour, the cups continued to be taken, and the room, which had felt like a threshold a moment ago, began to feel like something else entirely. Something she did not yet have a name for. Finally, she stepped forward. The distance from the doorway to the table was no more than 20 feet, but it felt longer, each step measured, deliberate, and when she reached the table, the orderly looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, and in that brief moment, she saw something she had not expected, recognition, not of who she was, but of what she was, a person standing in front of him. He poured the tea, set the cup down, and stepped back. Anna wrapped her fingers around the ceramic, feeling the heat against her skin, and for a second, she did not lift it. She remembered the stories, the warnings, the certainty that nothing given freely in this situation could be trusted, and that memory held her there, suspended between what she knew and what she was seeing. Then, slowly, she raised the cup. The steam touched her face, carrying a scent that was simple, familiar, and entirely out of place. She took a small sip. The warmth spread immediately, not just through her mouth, but down into her chest, and the effect was so ordinary, so human, that it disrupted her more than anything else had. She lowered the cup, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the women now seated on the cots, cups in their hands, the British soldiers moving quietly at the edges, not intruding, not withdrawing, simply present. And in that moment, Anna understood that this place was not going to confront her with force. It was going to confront her with something far more difficult to resist, a consistency that did not break, a restraint that did not demand recognition, and she realized, with a clarity that unsettled her, that whatever came next would not be about surviving what they did to her, but understanding what they chose not to do. The warmth did not fade as quickly as Anna expected. It stayed, lingering in her hands long after she lowered the cup, and that alone made her uneasy, because nothing about this place followed the rhythm she had prepared for. Around her, the room had settled into a quiet pattern, not silence exactly, but a low hum of presence, the soft shift of fabric as women adjusted on their cots, the faint clink of ceramic meeting wood, the almost imperceptible movement of air through the open windows, and, through it all, the British soldiers remained at the edges, never fully inside the space, never completely absent, as if they understood a boundary that did not need to be marked. Anna sat slowly, choosing a cot near the center, not too close to the door, not too far from it, a position that allowed her to see without being seen too clearly, and she placed the cup beside her, her fingers still resting on its edge, as if letting go entirely would mean accepting something she was not ready to accept. Across from her, the younger woman who had first approached the tea looked different now, not relaxed, not at ease, but steadier, her shoulders no longer drawn tight, her movements less cautious, and that change, small as it was, carried more weight than any command could have. Anna followed her gaze and realized the woman was watching the doorway, where Captain Whitmore had appeared again, not entering fully, not announcing himself, simply standing where the light from outside met the softer light within, creating a line that he did not cross. He observed the room with the same measured stillness as before, his presence neither intrusive nor distant, and when his eyes moved across the women, they did not linger, they did not search, they acknowledged and moved on, as if each person was noted without being examined. Anna felt that same brief contact again, that moment where his gaze met hers, and this time, She did not look away immediately. There was no challenge in it, no demand, only a kind of quiet recognition, and that unsettled her more than any hostility would have, because it left her without a clear response. He spoke then, not loudly, not as an order, but as information delivered with precision, each word placed carefully. You will be processed in groups. There is no need to hurry. And then he stepped back, allowing the space to remain what it was. The words carried no urgency, no pressure, and that absence forced a different kind of decision, one that came from within rather than from external force. A British orderly entered shortly after, carrying a clipboard, his steps light, his posture relaxed but attentive, and he called out names, one at a time, his pronunciation careful, sometimes imperfect, but always corrected quietly, as if accuracy mattered more than speed. When Anna heard her name, Keller, she felt a brief tightening in her chest, not from fear of what would happen, but from the simple fact of being singled out, of being seen as an individual rather than as part of a group. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her uniform out of habit, and crossed the room with the same measured steps she had used on the dock. Her awareness sharpened again, her senses attuned to every detail. The hallway beyond was narrower, the light more direct, and the sound of her own footsteps returned, echoing softly against the walls, a reminder that she was moving from one space into another, from observation into participation. The room she entered was smaller, functional, with a table, a chair, and a window that looked out onto a stretch of grass bordered by a low fence, and behind the table sat a British officer, older, his hair touched with gray, his expression neutral in a way that suggested experience rather than indifference. He gestured for her to sit, not with authority, but with clarity, and when she did, he began to ask questions, simple ones. Name, age, profession, each answered and recorded with steady precision. There was no interruption, no attempt to catch her in a mistake, only a consistent rhythm of question and answer that felt more like a process than an interrogation. Anna responded carefully, her voice even, her words measured, and as she spoke, she became aware of something she had not anticipated, the absence of pressure to prove anything, the absence of an expectation that she would fail. The officer wrote, nodded once, and moved on to the next question, and when he finished, he placed the paper aside and looked at her for a moment, not assessing, not judging, simply confirming that the exchange was complete. You will return to the main room, he said, and that was all. No instruction beyond what was necessary, no extension of authority beyond the moment. Anna stood, the chair making a soft sound against the floor, and she turned toward the door, her hand pausing on the handle for just a second longer than needed, because something in her had shifted again, not dramatically, not enough to name, but enough to register. When she stepped back into the larger room, the scene had not changed, and that consistency was what struck her most, the fact that nothing here seemed to rely on surprise, nothing depended on catching her unprepared. The women were still seated, still holding cups, still moving in that quiet, deliberate way, and the soldiers were still at the edges, maintaining that same careful distance. Anna returned to her cot, sat down, and lifted the cup again, the tea now cooler, but still warm enough to hold, and as she took another sip, she realized that the unease she felt was no longer tied to fear of harm, but to something far more complex, the slow, steady realization that the framework she had used to understand this moment was no longer sufficient, and that whatever replaced it would not come from a single event, but from the accumulation of these small, controlled, almost invisible choices made by the people around her, choices that revealed a kind of power she had not been taught to recognize, a power that did not announce itself, did not demand submission, but simply remained, consistent and unbroken, until it forced acknowledgement. The rhythm of the room held, steady and unbroken, and Anna began to notice something she had not seen before, not because it was hidden, but because it did not demand attention. The British soldiers did not watch constantly, they did not scan for mistakes, they did not hover, and yet nothing fell out of place. It was as if the order existed without enforcement, as if it had been decided long before she arrived, and would remain long after she left. She sat with the cup in her hands, now only faintly warm, and let her eyes move across the space again, slower this time, more deliberate, tracing patterns instead of searching for threats. A woman near the far wall adjusted her blanket, folding it with careful precision even though no one had asked her to. Another straightened the edge of her cot, aligning it with the frame beneath. Small actions, unnecessary in a place where no one seemed to be checking, and yet they happened, quietly, naturally, as if the environment itself encouraged them. Anna felt the shift inside her more clearly now, not a surrender, not acceptance, but a recalibration, the beginning of a different way of reading what was in front of her. The door opened again, and this time Captain Whitmore stepped inside, not fully, not crossing into the center, but far enough that his presence changed the balance of the room. Conversations, if they could be called that, lowered even further. Movements slowed by a fraction, and yet no one stood, no one snapped to attention. There was no visible command, only an awareness that settled like a second layer over everything. He walked along the edge of the room, his steps measured, his hands now free of gloves, his coat unbuttoned slightly, as if he had adjusted to the temperature. And he stopped near a window, looking out for a moment before turning back. Anna watched him closely now, not with suspicion alone, but with a kind of focused curiosity, because he represented something she could not yet define. A woman 2 cots away shifted too quickly as she stood, her foot catching the edge of the frame, and she lost her balance just enough to make the movement visible. It was not dramatic, not enough to draw attention in most places, but here, in this controlled quiet, it stood out. Anna felt the familiar tension return, the expectation that this would be corrected, that a voice would cut through the air, restoring order through force. Instead, Whitmore moved, not quickly, not with urgency, but with intention, closing the distance in a few calm steps, and he reached out. Not to grab, not to control, but to steady, his hand placed lightly against the back of the cot, creating a point of support the woman could use if she chose. She regained her balance on her own, her hand brushing the frame, and for a brief second, her eyes met his, wide, uncertain, and he simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before stepping back, returning to the edge of the room as if nothing had happened. No words, no correction, no reminder of rules. The moment passed, but it did not disappear. It settled, like everything else here, becoming part of the pattern Anna was beginning to understand. She realized then that what held this place together was not fear, not the anticipation of punishment, but something quieter, something that required participation rather than obedience. She lowered her gaze to the cup in her hands, the surface now still, the steam gone, and she turned it slightly, watching the light catch the rim, a small, ordinary detail that felt suddenly significant. Across the room, the younger woman who had first approached the tea stood again, this time more confidently, and carried her cup back to the table, placing it carefully among the others, aligning it with the row, her movements deliberate, almost respectful. No one had told her to do that. No one had instructed her on how to behave, and yet she did it as if it mattered. Anna felt a question form, not in words, but in sensation, a quiet pressure against everything she thought she knew about control and power. If no one was forcing this, then why was it happening? If no one was demanding compliance, then why did it exist? She looked back toward Whitmore, who had resumed his place near the window, his gaze moving across the room without lingering, and she understood something that unsettled her more deeply than any raised voice could have. This was not a performance, not a temporary display designed to achieve a specific outcome. It was consistent, unbroken, extending into every small action, every pause, every choice. And that consistency left no clear point of resistance, no obvious boundary to push against. It required something else entirely, something she had not been prepared for. The door at the far end opened again, and another group was called for processing, names spoken. With the same careful attention, the same measured pace, and the women rose one by one, moving toward the hallway without hesitation, without the tension that had filled their movements earlier. Anna remained seated, watching them go, and she noticed how their steps had changed, not faster, not slower, but steadier, as if the ground beneath them had become more certain. She lifted the cup once more, though there was little left, and held it near her lips without drinking, her thoughts moving in a way that felt unfamiliar, less defensive, more observant. She realized that the fear she had carried onto the dock had not been met with force. It had not been confirmed or denied. It had simply been allowed to exist until it began to dissolve on its own, replaced not by reassurance, but by evidence, repeated, consistent, impossible to ignore. And in that slow accumulation, she began to understand that whatever power existed here did not need to declare itself, because it was already present. In every choice not to escalate, in every moment where something could have been done and was not, she lowered the cup, set it beside her, and for the first time since stepping on a British soil, she allowed herself to sit without bracing for what might come next, not because she believed she was safe, but because she was beginning to understand that safety here was not something given or taken. It was something maintained, carefully, deliberately, by people who had decided, long before she arrived, what kind of place this would be, and who would not break that decision, not even for her. The pattern did not break, even as time moved forward, and Anna began to measure it not in minutes, but in repetitions, in the way each action echoed the one before it, consistent, deliberate, unchanged. The next group returned from processing with the same quiet composure. Their expressions altered in subtle ways that only someone watching closely would notice. A slight softening around the eyes, a less rigid set to the shoulders, as if something inside them had adjusted to match the rhythm of the place. Anna remained seated, but her stillness was no longer defensive. It had become observational, intentional, and she found herself anticipating what would happen next, not with fear, but with a kind of focused attention that felt unfamiliar. Across the room, the orderly, who had served the tea, began collecting the empty cups, moving from cot to cot without interrupting anyone, his steps light, his presence almost invisible except for the small changes he left behind, the cleared surfaces, the restored order. When he reached Anna, he paused, not reaching for the cup immediately, waiting just long enough for her to decide, and that pause carried more weight than any command could have. She looked at the cup, then at him, and for a brief moment, she understood that this was a choice being offered, not an instruction being given. She lifted the cup and handed it to him, her movement steady, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second, and he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, before moving on. The exchange was small, almost insignificant, but it marked something she could not ignore. The realization that participation here was voluntary in ways that did not make sense within the framework she had known. The door opened again, and this time, instead of names being called, a British soldier stepped inside carrying a stack of folded garments, his arms balanced, his pace even, and he placed them on a table near the center of the room, arranging them with the same care she had seen in every other action. "You may change if you wish," he said, his voice clear, neutral, and then he stepped back, returning to his place near the wall. No one moved immediately. The offer hung in the air, unclaimed, as if it required a different kind of courage to accept. Anna watched as one of the older women stood, her movements slower but certain, and approached the table, selecting a garment, examining it briefly before turning toward a screened corner of the room. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet unfolding of decisions, one after another. Anna felt the familiar resistance rise again. The instinct to wait, to observe, to ensure that this was not another layer of something she had not yet understood. But as she watched more women step forward, more choices made without consequence, she felt that resistance begin to lose its hold, not because it had been challenged, but because it no longer had evidence to support it. She stood, her movement unhurried, and crossed the room, her steps measured, her awareness sharp but no longer strained. The fabric of the garment was simple, practical, clean, and as she held it in her hands, she felt the weight of it, not just as an object, but as another piece of this environment that refused to align with her expectations. She moved toward the screened area, the thin partition creating a boundary that was respected without being enforced, and as she changed, she became aware of the quiet around her, the absence of intrusion, the space given without question. When she stepped back into the room, the garment fitting more comfortably than what she had worn before, she felt a shift that was physical as much as it was internal. A small adjustment that altered the way she stood, the way she moved. She returned to her cot, sitting again, and as she looked around, she noticed how the room had changed, not in structure, but in presence. The women now occupying it differently, their movements less guarded, their attention less fixed on the edges. Captain Whitmore remained near the window, his position unchanged, his role consistent, and Anna found herself watching him again, not to anticipate what he might do, but to understand what he would not do. He did not intervene unnecessarily. He did not correct what did not need correction, and that restraint, repeated over and over, created a kind of stability that did not rely on control. A faint sound came from outside, the distant rumble of a vehicle, the low hum of activity beyond the building. And for a moment, Anna was reminded that this place existed. Within a larger context, that beyond these walls, the world continued with its own uncertainties, its own tensions. But inside, the pattern held. A woman near the door spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, and another responded. The exchange brief, simple, human, and no one silenced them. No one marked the interaction as inappropriate, Anna felt. The final layer of her initial expectation began to dissolve, not replaced by trust, not yet, but by something more grounded, a recognition that what she was experiencing was not temporary, not conditional, but deliberate. She leaned back slightly, her hands resting on her knees, her posture no longer rigid, and she allowed herself to breathe without calculation, without preparing for interruption. The room did not react to her change, it did not notice, and that absence of reaction confirmed something she had been slowly understanding since the moment she stepped off the ship. This place did not require her to perform fear. It did not demand submission. It simply existed in a way that made those responses unnecessary. She looked once more toward Whitmore, who had not moved, who remained a constant point within the space, and she realized that his authority was not expressed through action, but through consistency, through the quiet assurance that what had been established would be maintained. And in that realization, Anna understood that the most difficult part of being here would not be enduring what might be done to her, but adjusting to what was not, to the absence of force where she had expected it, to the presence of restraint where she had been told there would be none, and that this adjustment would require something she had not yet fully found, the ability to accept a reality that did not need to prove itself, because it was already, quietly, undeniably, present. The day did not announce its next phase. It unfolded, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and Anna realized she had stopped waiting for a signal that would define what came next. Instead, she found herself noticing transitions, the subtle shifts that marked time without declaring it. The light through the windows had changed, less gray now, carrying a faint brightness that softened the edges of everything it touched, and with it came a new layer of activity, not louder, not faster, but different. A British orderly entered with a clipboard once more, but this time his movements were even more relaxed, his posture less formal, as if the initial threshold had already been crossed, and what followed required less structure. "You will be assigned work details later," he said, his voice steady. "For now, you will have a meal." And the words settled into the room without urgency, without expectation of reaction. Anna felt the sentence register differently than anything before it, not as a test, not as a condition, but as a continuation, a natural extension of what had already begun. The women rose gradually, not in unison, not in response to a command, but in response to the simple fact that movement had been introduced into the space. Anna stood with them, her steps now aligned with the rhythm she had been observing, her body no longer resisting the flow, but moving within it, the path to the next. Building was short, no more than 30 yards across a stretch of gravel bordered by low grass, and as she stepped outside, the air felt different than before, less sharp, more open, carrying the distant sounds of activity beyond the immediate space. A truck idled somewhere out of sight, its engine low and steady, and voices carried faintly from another part of the camp, indistinct but present, reminders that this place extended beyond what she could see. The British soldiers walked alongside them, not ahead, not behind, maintaining that same careful distance, and Anna noticed how their presence no longer created tension. It simply existed, integrated into the movement rather than defining it. The dining hall was larger than the room they had left, its ceiling higher, its windows wider, allowing more light to enter, and inside, Long tables were arranged in parallel lines, each set with simple utensils, each space prepared in advance. The smell reached her first, warm, unmistakable. Bread, vegetables, something cooked slowly, something that required time and attention, and the familiarity of it struck her in a way she had not expected. She paused at the threshold for a fraction of a second, not from hesitation, but from recognition, the realization that this was not a ration, not a minimal provision, but a meal. The women moved forward, filling the space gradually, taking seats without instruction, choosing places based on proximity, on comfort, on instinct. Anna sat near the center again, her position consistent with where she had been before, and she placed her hands on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers, the solidity of it grounding her in a way that felt new. A British cook stood behind a serving line, his sleeves rolled, his movements efficient but unhurried, and as each woman approached, he served the food with the same measured care. Portion by portion, without variation, without judgment. When it was Anna's turn, she stepped forward, her eyes briefly meeting his, and he nodded once, placing the food on her plate, his actions precise, practiced, and she realized that even here, in something as ordinary as serving a meal, the same pattern held. She carried the plate back to her seat, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands, not heavy, but substantial, and as she set it down, she looked at it, taking in the details, the texture, the color, the quiet evidence of effort. Around her, the room remained calm, the sound of movement low, the absence of noise almost as noticeable as the presence of food. No one rushed to eat. No one reached immediately, and that pause, shared across the room, created a moment that felt suspended, as if everyone was waiting for something that did not come. Anna felt the old instinct again, the expectation that there would be a signal, a command, a word that would release them into action, but instead, the moment passed on its own, and one by one, the women began to eat, not quickly, not urgently, but steadily, as if the act itself required attention. She picked up the utensil, her hand steady, and took the first bite. The taste simple, clear, unambiguous, and it carried with it the same disruption she had felt with the tea, the same quiet contradiction of everything she had been told. She chewed slowly, aware of the room around her, aware of the fact that no one was watching her, no one was measuring her response, and that absence of observation allowed something else to emerge, something closer to presence than to survival. Across the table, the younger woman looked up briefly, their eyes meeting for a second, and in that exchange, there was no shared fear, no silent agreement of danger, only a recognition that they were both experiencing something they had not prepared for. Anna lowered her gaze back to the plate, continuing to eat, her movements steady, her breathing even, and as the meal progressed, she became aware of a shift that was no longer subtle, the gradual replacement of tension with something quieter, something that did not demand immediate understanding. Captain Whitmore entered the hall at some point, his presence noted but not disruptive, and he moved along the edge of the room as he had before, observing without intruding, maintaining that same consistent distance. Anna watched him briefly, then returned her attention to the meal, and in that choice, she recognized the final change of the day, not in the environment, which had remained constant, but in herself, in the way her focus had shifted from anticipating what might happen to engaging with what was. The meal ended without announcement. Without a clear signal, the plates gradually emptied, the movement slowing, then stopping, and the orderlies began to collect them with the same quiet efficiency as before, restoring the room to its initial state. Anna remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting on the table, her posture relaxed in a way she would not have allowed herself hours earlier, and she understood, with a clarity that felt both simple and profound, that the power she had expected to encounter had not disappeared. It had simply taken a different form, one that did not rely on force or fear, but on consistency, on restraint, on the deliberate choice to maintain a standard that did not need to be enforced because it was already embodied by those who held it. And that realization, more than anything else, marked the beginning of something she had not yet fully named, but could no longer deny. The return from the dining hall did not feel like a transition back to confinement. It felt like a continuation, and that difference settled into Anna's awareness as she walked the same 30 yards across gravel, her steps now familiar with the sound they made, her body no longer bracing against each movement. The air had shifted again, cooler now, carrying a faint dampness that hinted at evening approaching, and the light had softened further, stretching shadows along the ground in long, quiet lines. The women moved together but not as a unit, each step individual yet aligned, and the British soldiers remained present in the same measured way, their distance unchanged, their role consistent. Inside the barracks, the room held the same order it had before, the cots aligned, the blankets folded, the surfaces clear, and yet something within it had changed, not in structure, but in how it was occupied. Anna returned to her place without hesitation, sitting with a posture that no longer felt imposed, and she noticed how the others did the same, choosing their spaces with a quiet certainty that had not been there earlier. The absence of instruction continued, and with it came a different kind of awareness, the understanding that what happened next would not be directed, but chosen. A few women spoke in low voices, their words indistinct, their tone careful but no longer strained, and no one silenced them. No one marked the boundary between allowed and forbidden, because that boundary, Anna realized, was not being enforced from the outside. It was being maintained from within. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, her hands loosely clasped, and let her gaze move across the room once more, not searching, not measuring, simply observing. The younger woman from earlier sat across from her, her back straight, her movements deliberate as she adjusted the edge of her blanket again, smoothing it with a care that seemed unnecessary and yet meaningful. Anna watched the motion, the repetition, and understood that these small acts were not about the objects themselves. They were about something else, something that had begun to take shape in the space between what was required and what was chosen. The door opened quietly, and an orderly entered, not carrying anything this time, his hands empty, his posture relaxed, and he stood near the center of the room, not elevated, not commanding attention, but present enough to be noticed. "You will have time to rest," he said, his voice even. "Later, assignments will be explained." And then he stepped back, leaving the statement to exist without reinforcement. No one asked questions. No one moved immediately. The room absorbed the information in the same way it had absorbed everything else, without resistance, without urgency. Anna leaned back slightly, her shoulders resting against the wall behind her cot, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed her eyes to close, not fully, but enough to soften the edges of what she saw. The sounds of the room remained, the low murmur of voices, the faint shift of fabric, the distant hum from outside, and within that sound, she felt something she had not expected to feel here, not comfort, not yet, but a kind of steadiness that did not rely on certainty. She opened her eyes again and looked toward the window, where the light had dimmed further, the sky now a muted blue-gray, and she saw Captain Whitmore pass by outside, his figure moving along the edge of the building, his pace unhurried, his presence consistent even beyond the walls. He did not enter this time, and that absence was as deliberate as his earlier presence, a reminder that his role did not depend on constant visibility. Anna followed his movement until he disappeared from view, and she realized that she no longer needed to watch him to understand what he represented. It was already present in the room, in the way everything held together without pressure, in the way choices were made without being forced. A woman near the far corner stood and walked to the window, pausing there for a moment before turning back, her movement unremarkable and yet entirely her own, and no one marked it, no one questioned it. Anna felt the final layer of tension in her body begin to release, not all at once, not completely, but enough that she could recognize it as something that had been there and was now less. She shifted her position slightly, stretching her legs out in front of her, the movement simple, ordinary, and she allowed it without checking herself, without anticipating correction. The room did not react. It simply continued. The passage of time became less defined by events and more by presence, by the steady unfolding of moments that did not demand attention and yet accumulated into something significant. Anna realized then that the most profound change was not in what had been given to them, not in the tea or the meal or the clean garments, but in what had not been taken, not been imposed, not been forced. That absence created space. And within that space, something else had begun to grow, something quieter than trust, but more stable than fear. She looked around the room once more, taking in the women, the cots, the light, the stillness, and she understood that whatever this place was, it was not temporary, not a performance designed to end, but a standard that would continue. Moment after moment, choice after choice, she rested her hands at her sides, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the cot, and allowed herself to sit in that understanding without trying to resolve it, without trying to name it, because for the first time since she had stepped onto this soil, she did not need to prepare for what might come next. She only needed to remain present for what already was. The evening did not arrive with a signal. It settled slowly, almost unnoticed, until the light inside the room shifted from gray to something softer, something dimmer, and Anna became aware that time had moved forward without asking for her attention. The windows no longer held the same clarity, the sky beyond them now a deeper shade, and the edges of objects inside the room began to blur slightly, not disappearing, but losing their sharpness, as if the day itself was stepping back. The women remained in their places, some lying down, others sitting quietly, their movements reduced to what was necessary, and the low murmur of voices had faded into something even quieter, a presence more than a sound. Anna stayed seated for a while longer, her back against the wall, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and she let her breathing fall into the same steady rhythm that seemed to define everything here. There was no announcement of rest, no instruction to lie down, and yet one by one, the women began to shift, turning toward their cots, adjusting blankets, lowering themselves into positions that suggested sleep would come when it came. Anna watched this unfold with a kind of quiet recognition, understanding that even this part of the day was not directed, it was simply allowed. She stood slowly, her movement deliberate but unguarded, and turned toward her own cot, her hands smoothing the blanket out of habit before she sat, then lay back, her head resting against the thin pillow. The ceiling above her was plain, unmarked, and she found herself focusing on it for a moment, tracing the faint lines where the panels met, small details that grounded her in the physical space. The sounds of the room continued around her, the soft shift of fabric, the quiet exhale of someone settling, the distant hum from outside that had not changed since earlier, and within that sound, she felt something she had not expected to feel here, a sense of continuity that did not depend on what she had known before. Her body, which had held tension for so long, began to respond to this environment in ways she had not anticipated, her shoulders lowering, her muscles releasing, not all at once, but enough that she could feel the difference. She turned her head slightly, her gaze moving toward the window, where the last of the light remained, a thin line along the horizon, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply look, without searching, without expecting anything to change. A shadow passed outside, a figure moving along the path, and she recognized the outline of Captain Whitmore again, his pace unchanged, his posture the same, and he paused briefly near the window, not looking in, but standing there as if marking the boundary between inside and outside. He did not enter, he did not speak, and after a moment, he continued on, disappearing into the dimming light. Anna watched until he was gone, and then she returned her gaze to the ceiling, her thoughts moving more slowly now, less driven by the need to resolve what she was experiencing. She realized that the absence of force, which had unsettled her at first, had begun to create something else, a space where her own reactions were no longer dictated by anticipation, but by observation. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket over herself, the fabric light but sufficient, and she felt the warmth settle in a way that was simple, unremarkable, and yet significant. Across the room, someone turned over, the cot making a faint sound, and another woman adjusted her position, the movement quiet, contained, and no one reacted, no one corrected. Because nothing needed to be corrected, the room held itself, just as it had all day, without pressure, without interruption. Anna closed her eyes briefly, not fully, just enough to let the darkness replace the dim light, and she listened, the sounds of the room blending into a single, steady presence that did not demand her attention. When she opened her eyes again, the light had faded further, the outlines of the room softer now, and she felt a sense of time passing that was not measured by events, but by the gradual shift from one state to another. She turned onto her side, her hand resting near the edge of the cot, her fingers lightly touching the wood, and she allowed herself to remain there without adjusting, without checking, without anticipating. The thought came to her then, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet realization that everything she had expected to define this place had not appeared, and that in its absence, something else had taken shape, something that did not need to be explained to exist. She did not try to name it. She did not try to understand it fully, because she sensed that it was not something that could be grasped all at once. It would reveal itself over time, through repetition, through consistency, through the same pattern that had carried her through the day. Her breathing slowed further, her body settling into the cot, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to close her eyes completely, not because she felt safe, but because she no longer felt the need to remain alert to something that had not come. The room remained as it was, steady, quiet, unchanged, and as sleep approached, not suddenly, but gradually, Anna understood that the most significant shift had already occurred, not in the world around her, but in the way she was beginning to exist within it, not resisting, not submitting, but observing, and in that observation, finding a kind of balance she had not known was possible. The night did not interrupt this. It simply continued it, carrying the same pattern forward into darkness, where nothing needed to be seen for it to remain true. Morning did not break. It revealed itself slowly, as if the light had been waiting just beyond the walls for the right moment to return, and when Anna opened her eyes, it was already there, soft and gray at first, filtering through the windows in a way that did not interrupt, only replaced the darkness with something gentler. She did not move immediately, her body still resting in the position she had settled into hours before, and for a moment, she simply listened, the room around her quiet, but not empty, the subtle presence of others still there in the faint rhythm of breathing, in the occasional shift of fabric against wood. No alarm, no call, no command to begin the day, and yet it had begun. She turned her head slightly, her gaze adjusting to the returning light, and she noticed the details again, the same lines of the ceiling, the same arrangement of cots, unchanged, consistent, as if the night had passed without altering anything that mattered. Across the room, one woman was already sitting up, her movements slow, deliberate, not hurried, and another followed, then another, the room gradually coming back to life, not as a reaction, but as a continuation. Anna pushed herself up, her hands pressing lightly against the cot, her muscles responding without resistance, and she sat there for a moment, her feet resting on the floor, her posture relaxed in a way that felt new. The air carried a different scent now, faint but present, something warm again, something that suggested the day would follow the same pattern as before, not identical, but aligned. She stood, smoothing the blanket out of habit, the motion automatic now, and she realized that what had felt unfamiliar yesterday had already begun to settle into something recognizable. The door opened quietly, and an orderly stepped in, his presence as measured as it had been before, his expression neutral, his voice steady. "Breakfast will be served," he said, and nothing more, no urgency, no expectation beyond the words themselves. The women moved, not all at once, not in unison, but in a gradual flow, each deciding when to stand, when to step forward, and Anna found herself joining that movement without hesitation, her body aligning with the rhythm she had already begun to understand. Outside, the air was cooler than the day before, carrying a light breeze that moved across the open space, and the sky above was brighter now, though still muted, the kind of morning that did not rush into clarity but eased into it. The gravel beneath her boots made the same soft sound as before, familiar now, and she noticed how her steps no longer carried the same weight, the same tension. They simply marked her movement from one place to another. The dining hall appeared the same as it had the previous day, unchanged, the tables aligned, the light entering through the wide windows, and as she stepped inside, she felt the same quiet recognition, the understanding that this space, like the others, held its order without needing to assert it. The meal was prepared, the smell consistent with what she had experienced before, and the process unfolded in the same measured way, each person stepping forward, receiving, returning, no variation, no disruption. Anna took her place at the table, her hands resting on the surface, and she noticed how natural the motion felt now, how little thought it required. Across from her, the younger woman met her gaze again, and this time, there was something different. In the exchange, not uncertainty, not shared confusion, but a quiet acknowledgement, as if they both understood that what they were experiencing was no longer entirely new. The food was placed before her, and she began to eat, her movements steady, her attention present but not guarded, and as she did, she became aware of something that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there and she had not noticed it. The absence of internal resistance, the absence of the constant calculation that had defined her first moments here. The room held its quiet, the same low presence of movement and sound, and Captain Whitmore entered again, his path along the edge unchanged, his role consistent, and Anna saw him. But she did not focus on him the way she had before. She registered his presence and then returned to her meal, and in that small shift, she recognized something significant, that her understanding of this place no longer depended on observing him, because the pattern he represented had already been established. The meal ended as it had before, without announcement. The plates gradually cleared, the room returning to its initial state, and as Anna stood, preparing to leave, she realized that the uncertainty that had defined her arrival had not disappeared. It had transformed, becoming something quieter, something that did not demand immediate answers. The path back to the barracks felt shorter now, not because the distance had changed, but because her perception of it had. And as she walked, she noticed the details again, the grass along the edges, the faint sound of activity in the distance, the steady presence of the soldiers who moved with the same measured pace. Inside, the room awaited them, unchanged, and as she returned to her place, sitting once more on the cot, she understood that the day ahead would not reveal itself through sudden events, but through the same steady accumulation of moments, each one reinforcing what she had already begun to see. She rested her hands on her knees, her posture calm, and allowed herself to remain present without anticipating what would come next, because she had learned, in the quiet way this place required, that what came next would not need to be forced. It would simply arrive, as everything else had, consistent, deliberate, and already part of a pattern that no longer needed to prove itself. The announcement came without emphasis, as if it had already been decided long before anyone heard it. And when the orderly stepped into the room again, his presence did not interrupt the rhythm, it simply added to it. "Work assignments will begin shortly," he said, his voice steady, his tone unchanged, and the words settled into the space the same way everything else had, without urgency, without pressure, and yet they carried a different weight. Anna felt it immediately, not as tension, but as a shift, a movement from observation into participation. The room responded in the same gradual way it always did, women rising one by one, adjusting their garments, smoothing their blankets before stepping away, small actions that no longer felt uncertain, but intentional. Anna stood as well, her movement aligned with the others, her posture steady, and she noticed how her hands no longer paused before acting, how her decisions no longer required the same careful calculation. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the breeze lighter now, carrying with it the faint sound of distant activity, and the path ahead led not back to the dining hall, but toward a different part of the camp, one she had not yet seen. The British soldiers accompanied them as before, not directing, not controlling, but present, their steps measured, their distance consistent, and Anna found that she did not need to watch them as closely, because their behavior had already established itself as predictable in a way that required no further confirmation. The group was guided toward an open area bordered by low buildings and a stretch of grass that extended beyond the immediate space. And there, they paused, not because they were told to, but because the movement naturally came to a halt. A man stood at the far end, his posture upright, his presence calm, and as Anna drew closer, she recognized him as Captain Whitmore, his role now shifting from observer to something more defined, though still restrained. He waited until the group had settled, until the movement had ceased on its own, and then he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach them without effort. "You will be assigned tasks based on your skills," he said, each word clear, deliberate. "You will work, you will rest, and you will be treated fairly." And then he paused, not for effect, but to allow the words to exist without being followed by anything else. Anna listened, her attention focused not only on what he said, but on how he said it, the absence of emphasis, the lack of any attempt to persuade or assert, and she realized that even here, in something as structured as assigning work, the same pattern held. Names were called, one at a time, each woman stepping forward, receiving her assignment in a few simple words, and then stepping aside, the process moving steadily, without interruption, without variation. When Anna heard her name, she stepped forward, her movement smooth, her gaze level, and she stood before Whitmore, not directly facing him, but within the space he had created, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. "Nursing experience," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and she nodded once, the gesture small, controlled. "You will assist in the infirmary," he continued, his tone unchanged, and that was all. No instruction beyond what was necessary, no elaboration, only the assignment itself. Anna stepped back, returning to the group, and as she did, she felt something shift again, not dramatically, but enough to recognize the transition from being placed within this environment to contributing to it in some way. The group began to disperse, guided not by commands, but by direction, each woman moving toward the area indicated to her. And Anna followed the path toward a smaller building set slightly apart from the others, its windows open. The interior visible even from a distance. The closer she came, the more she noticed the details, the arrangement of beds inside, the clean surfaces, the quiet movement of a British medic working at a table, his focus steady, his actions precise. She stepped inside, pausing just beyond the threshold, and the medic looked up, his expression neutral, his gaze direct but not intrusive. "You are here to assist," he said, his voice calm, and she nodded, stepping further into the room, her eyes taking in the space, the order, the same consistency she had seen everywhere else. There were no raised voices, no urgency, only a steady rhythm of tasks being completed, one after another. And as she moved closer, she found herself aligning with that rhythm, her hands responding to what needed to be done without waiting for instruction. The work itself was simple, organizing supplies, preparing materials, small tasks that required attention but not explanation, and as she engaged in them, she realized that this, too, followed the same pattern, not enforced, not rushed, but maintained through consistency. Time moved differently here, not marked by events, but by the completion of tasks, by the steady progression from one action to the next, and Anna found herself becoming part of that progression without resistance. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued, faint but present, and inside, the room held its quiet order, the same balance she had come to recognize. She glanced once toward the window, where the light had shifted again, indicating the passage of hours, and she understood that the day was unfolding in the same way as the one before it, not repeating, but reinforcing. When she looked back at her hands, at the work she was doing, she saw something she had not expected to see, not just the completion of tasks, but the reflection of the same principle that had defined everything since her arrival, the deliberate choice to maintain a standard that did not require force to exist. And in that realization, Anna understood that the true nature of this place was not revealed in a single moment, but in the accumulation of all these moments, each one consistent, each one unbroken, until the pattern itself became undeniable, not because it demanded belief, but because it left no space for anything else. The hours did not pass in a way Anna could measure. They accumulated, quietly, through repetition, through the steady continuation of tasks that did not announce their beginning or their end. And by the time she became aware of the change, it had already happened. The light through the infirmary windows had shifted again, warmer now, angled differently, casting longer shadows across the floor, and the air carried a subtle difference, a stillness that suggested the day was beginning to slow. She stood at the table, her hands moving with a rhythm that no longer required thought, organizing, preparing, placing each item where it belonged. and she realized that the work had become something more than a task. It had become a pattern she could rely on, something that did not change unexpectedly. The British medic worked nearby, his movements consistent, his attention focused, and though they had exchanged few words, the space between them had settled into something functional, something that did not need explanation. Anna noticed how he did not watch her closely, did not correct her unnecessarily, and yet the work remained precise, the order intact, as if the standard existed independently of oversight. A patient lay on one of the beds, resting quietly, and Anna moved toward him with the same measured steps she had adopted since arriving, her actions calm, deliberate, her presence unobtrusive. She adjusted the blanket slightly, not because she was told to, but because it needed to be done, and the man acknowledged her with a small nod. Nothing more, no words, and she returned the gesture in kind before stepping back. The interaction was simple, almost invisible, and yet it carried the same weight as everything else. The same quiet affirmation that what was happening here did not require force to exist. Outside, the sounds of the camp had softened, the earlier activity reduced to a low hum, and Anna became aware of how the entire place seemed to move in cycles, not rigidly defined, but consistent enough to be recognized. She stepped back from the table, her hands momentarily still, and looked toward the window, where the sky had taken on a deeper tone, the light no longer bright, but steady, as if holding the last of the day in place. She thought of the moment she had arrived, the expectation she had carried with her, the certainty of what would happen, and she compared it to what she was experiencing now, and the contrast was not sharp, not sudden, but gradual, built over hours of observation, of small, repeated choices that had reshaped her understanding without forcing it. The door opened quietly, and Captain Whitmore entered, his presence unchanged, his movement along the edge of the room as measured as ever, and he paused near the center, his gaze taking in the space without lingering. Anna noticed him, but she did not stop what she was doing. She did not shift her posture. She simply acknowledged his presence and continued, and in that moment, she understood that her relationship to his authority had changed, not diminished, but redefined. He did not need to direct her, and she did not need to respond to him as she once would have, because the structure he represented was already present in the way she acted. He spoke briefly with the medic, their conversation low, practical, and then he turned slightly, his gaze passing over Anna once more, and for a brief second, there was a pause, not in his movement, but in the space between them, a recognition that did not require words. Anna held that moment without reacting, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, and then it passed, as everything else here did, without emphasis, without disruption. Whitmore moved on, exiting the room as quietly as he had entered, and the space returned to its previous state. Unchanged, consistent. Anna returned to the table, her hands resuming their work, and she realized that the most significant change was no longer external. It was internal, the way she moved, the way she chose, the way she understood what was happening around her. She was no longer measuring each moment against what she had been told. She was measuring it against what she was experiencing, and that experience had proven itself, not through a single act, but through the accumulation of many. The day continued to settle, the light dimming further, the shadows lengthening, and the tasks became fewer, the rhythm slowing, until there was nothing left to do but maintain what had already been established. Anna stepped back once more, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and she allowed herself to stand still, to observe the room without searching for what might come next. She understood now that what defined this place was not what it could do, but what it consistently chose not to do. And that choice, repeated over time, had created something stronger than any display of force. She turned toward the window again, the sky now a deeper shade, the boundary between day and night approaching, and she felt a sense of continuity that extended beyond this moment, beyond this room, beyond this day. The pattern would continue. She knew that now, not because she had been told, but because she had seen it, lived it, and in that understanding, she found a kind of steadiness that did not depend on certainty, but on consistency. She moved toward the door, not because she was instructed to, but because the day was ending, and as she stepped outside, the air cooler now, the light fading, she realized that the place she had feared upon arrival had not changed. It had simply revealed itself, piece by piece, through every quiet decision, every measured action, until there was nothing left to question except what she had once believed about power and what she now understood it to be. The evening returned with the same quiet certainty as before, not announced, not imposed, but present in the way the lights softened and the air cooled. And as Anna stepped back toward the barracks, she realized that she no longer needed to look for signs to understand what part of the day she was in. The path felt familiar now, each step grounded not by caution, but by recognition. And the gravel beneath her boots no longer echoed uncertainty. It simply marked movement. Inside, the room held the same order, unchanged, and yet it felt different, not because the space had altered, but because she had. She moved to her cot without hesitation, her hands smoothing the blanket in the same quiet motion she had repeated before, and as she sat, she noticed how natural it had become, how little thought it required. The other women returned in a similar way, their movements aligned not by instruction, but by shared understanding, each one settling into place with a calm that had not existed. When they first arrived, no one spoke loudly, no one needed to. The room carried its own rhythm, and within it, the presence of others was no longer a source of tension, but a part of the environment itself. Anna leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, and she let her gaze move across the room, not searching, not measuring, simply observing. She saw the same details she had seen before, the alignment of the cots, the folded blankets, the clear surfaces, but now those details no longer felt like evidence to be analyzed. They felt like something established, something stable. The door opened quietly, and an orderly stepped in, his presence consistent with everything she had come to expect, and he spoke in the same measured tone. "Evening meal will be served shortly." And then he stepped back, leaving the words to settle without further direction. The room responded as it always did, gradually, without urgency. Women rising one by one, adjusting their garments, preparing to move. And Anna followed, her steps steady, her awareness present but unguarded. Outside, the air had cooled further, the light now low, stretching shadows across the ground, and the sky carried the last colors of the day, muted but clear. The dining hall welcomed them again with the same quiet order, the tables arranged, the food prepared, the process unchanged, and Anna found comfort in that consistency, not because it was familiar, but because it was reliable. She took her place, her hands resting on the table, and as the meal was served, she noticed how her attention had shifted, no longer focused on what might happen, but on what was happening, the simple act of sitting, of eating, of being present, within a space that did not demand anything from her beyond participation. Across from her, the younger woman met her gaze once more, and this time, there was a faint, almost imperceptible change, not a smile, not an expression that could be easily named, but a softening, a recognition that what they were experiencing was no longer unfamiliar. Anna returned her attention to the meal, her movements steady, and she felt a sense of continuity that extended beyond the moment, a quiet assurance that the pattern would hold. Captain Whitmore entered as he had before, his presence steady, his movement along the edge of the room unchanged, and Anna noticed him without focusing on him. Her awareness of him integrated into her understanding of the space. He did not need to act. He did not need to speak, because everything he represented was already present in the way the room functioned. The meal concluded as it always did, without announcement, the plates cleared, the room returning to its initial state. And as Anna stood, she realized that the transition from one part of the day to another no longer carried uncertainty. It simply marked time. The walk back to the barracks felt shorter again, not because of distance, but because of perception, and as she stepped inside, she understood that the space no longer needed to prove itself to her. It had already done so. She returned to her cot, sitting, then lying back, her body settling into the same position as before, and she allowed herself to rest without hesitation, without the need to remain alert. The room quieted gradually, the sounds of movement fading, the presence of others becoming a steady, familiar background. And as the light dimmed further, Anna closed her eyes, not as a decision, but as a natural response to the environment. She realized then that what had changed was not the world around her. It was her relationship to it, the way she no longer resisted what she experienced, the way she no longer searched for contradictions that did not exist. The absence of force, which had once unsettled her, had become something she could rely on, not because it was promised, but because it had been demonstrated repeatedly, consistently, without exception. And in that realization, she understood that the true strength of this place was not in what it could impose, but in what it chose to maintain, moment after moment, choice after choice, until there was no need for anything else. The night settled in fully, the room dim, the sounds reduced to the quiet rhythm of breathing, and Anna allowed herself to rest within that rhythm, her thoughts no longer searching, no longer questioning, but simply existing alongside what she had come to understand, a quiet, steady truth that did not need to be spoken to be real. The final understanding did not arrive in a single moment. It settled, slowly, the way everything else in this place had settled, through repetition, through consistency, through the quiet accumulation of choices that never broke pattern. And as Anna lay on her cot, her eyes open in the dim light before sleep, she realized that what had changed could no longer be undone. The room around her held the same steady presence, the same soft rhythm of breathing, the same absence of interruption, and it no longer felt like something she needed to interpret. It simply was. She turned her head slightly, her gaze moving toward the window where only a faint outline of the outside world remained, and she thought back to the moment she had first stepped onto this soil, the weight of expectation, the certainty of what would happen, and how none of it had come to pass. Not because it had been replaced by something louder, something more dramatic, but because it had been met, quietly, by something stronger. She understood now that the power she had been taught to fear had not been denied. It had been redefined. It had not shown itself through force, through raised voices or visible control. It had revealed itself through restraint, through the deliberate decision to maintain order without imposing it, to create structure without enforcing it through fear. She thought of Captain Whitmore, of the way he had stood at the edge of every space, never needing to step into the center, never needing to assert himself beyond what was necessary. And she understood that his authority did not come from what he could do, but from what he consistently chose not to do. The memory of his voice returned to her, not loud, not commanding, but clear, precise. And she realized that every word he had spoken had been supported by everything that followed, by every action, every moment that had reinforced the same standard. She shifted slightly on the cot, her hand resting against the edge, and she felt the same calm presence in her body that had replaced the tension of the day before. It was not comfort in the way she had known it before the war. It was something steadier, something that did not depend on circumstance, but on consistency. Across the room, a woman turned in her sleep, the cot making a faint sound, and then settling again, and no one reacted, no one needed to, because nothing here required correction unless it truly disrupted the balance, and almost nothing did. Anna closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, and she realized that she no longer needed to test what she was experiencing against what she had been told. She no longer needed to search for contradictions, because there were none. The pattern held, not perfectly, not rigidly, but consistently enough that it could be trusted without being questioned. She understood then that the most significant shift had not been in her surroundings, but in her perception, in the way she now recognized strength not as something that demanded attention, but as something that maintained itself quietly, without deviation. The night deepened around her, the room dim, the sounds reduced to almost nothing, and she allowed her eyes to close fully, her breathing steady, her body at rest in a way that did not require vigilance. The final thought that remained with her was not one of fear, not one of uncertainty, but one of recognition, that the world she had been taught to see in absolutes had revealed itself to be something more complex, more nuanced, shaped not only by what people did, but by what they chose not to do. And in that realization, she understood that the true measure of power was not in its display, but in its control, not in its volume, but in its restraint, and that what she had encountered here was not the absence of strength, but its most refined form, the kind that did not need to be proven, because it was already quietly, undeniably present.